Guatsi, Sehopa, Tawae. Greetings, everybody. My name is Serra Hoagland. I'm really happy to be here today and discuss tribal engagement. I work for the USDA Forest Service in the Rocky Mountain Research Station, Missoula Fire Sciences Lab, but my duty station is based at Salish Kootenai College, which is a tribal college on the Flathead Indian Reservation. There in my job, I promote any of the native students there who are in wildlife and forestry and in fisheries, mentor them, advise them, and then I also conduct tribally relevant research. And then sort of my third duty is to conduct tribally or work with intertribal organizations and collaborations. I'm an enrolled member of the Pueblo of Laguna and really happy to be on this panel today. I'll mainly talk about eras of federal Indian history and policy and kind of weave that into my own personal story because it's a really important piece for Native people as we think about managing the landscape. And then I'll also talk about traditional ecological knowledge and a little bit of co-production of knowledge and about Native youth engagement. So thank you again for being here today. So this is a picture of my family. I can't start a talk without recognizing and acknowledging the Native women who have come before me. There on the left is my mother, that's Sandra Jolene Hamilton Hoagland. This is taken when she was 4 years old. This is taken off the reservation in Barstow, which is where a lot of Laguna people went. We actually have a Laguna colony there in Barstow because of our relationship with the Santa Fe Railroad. To my mom's side is my grandmother, that's Elaine Paisano. And she felt pretty adamant about Indian education, and in fact she received her bachelor's degree from Northern Arizona University before she could even vote back in her home state. That was in the late 40s. To her side then is my great-grandmother, that's Dora Pacheco Paisano, and then to her side is my great-great-grandmother, Lolita Alonzo. So just really proud of these women, and I have to acknowledge them and their contribution as well. And along the panorama there, you'll see that's my reservation. That's where I hunt and go back home every fall when I can. Not during the pandemic, unfortunately, but it is beautiful country, and we protect it as much as possible. So to jump right into the timeline of federal Indian policy, I think this is an important place to start because a lot of what we see today as far as tribal communities, the health and well-being of our communities, and then also, how we manage our natural resources relates to a lot of these policies that have gone on throughout the government eras. And if you just take a quick glance and look at the titles of some of these, you'll recognize that it's really not a happy past. Unfortunately, a lot of these topics aren't covered in a lot of our U.S. history classes. But you can just, look at Indian removal era, Indian reorganization era, allotment and assimilation, termination and relocation, and then more recently into Indian self-determination. And this has been very important for tribal communities more recently in providing more autonomy to our individual nations. But just to overlap my family's history on this, my great-grandmother was around during the Reservation and the Indian Reorganization Act. Same with my great-grandmother. My grandmother was around during allotment and assimilation, and that was part of again, I mentioned the Laguna colony in Barstow, so a lot of our tribal members went to work off reservation, and that was a part of that government act. And then my mother was around during the termination and relocation era, and then you can kind of see where I start there at the end after self-determination. I did highlight 1680 because that's the All Pueblo Revolt, and that is the only indigenous-led war where indigenous people won. So that's a really important one to keep on there, and proud of that as a Pueblo person. Now to jump and switch gears to talk about a little bit of traditional ecological knowledge. Some of the other corollary terms are native science, local ecological knowledge, but TEK I think, really serves as a nice complement to Western science. TEK is described as more abstract, it's more holistic, it's much more qualitative, and it's primarily obtained through practitioners. And having experience-based learning on the landscape. Western science, on the other hand, is much more quantitative, it's much more intellectual, it's more concrete, it's sort of exclusive in each little box. And it's primarily obtained and shared through, like we all know, the peer-reviewed publication process. But one thing to really note is that a lot of our TEK, because it's based on native languages and customs and practices, it's rapidly disappearing. Unfortunately, there's been a huge, especially with COVID, we've lost a lot of our elders, but we have to remember that TEK is something that is tied to our language, and we are losing that. Luckily, we do have a lot of language revitalization programs, so that is helping, but it's important to note that it is disappearing. That table came from Mason et al. In the Journal of Forestry. There are a lot of similarities. I'll just quickly fly through this because I'd like to get to some of my other slides here, but both of them really do have broad applications in natural resource management and increase our understanding about the world around us and the processes. But one thing to note is that TEK is much more place-based. It's easy to talk about it, but really to get into it is you have to go to these places and we have to talk to the people. So we talk with this Navajo or Dene grandmother and talk to her about the monsoon cycle, or we talk to these Tule River youth about the giant sequoia trees and the fire regimes. They're standing next to a fire scar underneath a giant sequoia. We would talk to the Eastern Band of Cherokee elders about the medicinal plants that they harvest in the deciduous forest. Or we talk to the elders, like where I'm based up in Montana, about reintroducing fire to the landscape in the Ponderosa pine forest. So really it's place-based. It's hard to talk about it, in an overarching sense, but really going to that local scales where it's actually useful. A couple things about co-production of knowledge with tribes I did want to touch on. So this is, if we're trying to understand more about wildlife populations or understand maybe what's going on in terms of threats, or maybe there's some concern that's going on with the wildlife that we all might be co-managing. We might be wanting to tap into and work with tribes. So a couple of things I wanted to point out about some tenets of indigenous research methodologies. This would be ideal if we can do this, but it really needs to benefit the community that it's intended to serve. Most of the time we've used an extraction model when working with tribal communities, but it really has to benefit the community that it's supposed to serve. I aim to help build tribal capacity and provide resources. Another tenet of indigenous research methodologies is that it must respect tribal sovereignty and self-determination, which are things that my other co-presenters are going to be discussing. It's also sensitive to data rights, and it doesn't threaten the tribe's ability to protect their data. And then lastly, it does include the 4 R's of what we say: responsibility, reciprocity, respect, and relationship. So with that, we do have the Intertribal Timber Council tribal research needs assessment. I used to serve as the co-chair of that subcommittee, and we have that publication right now in the Journal of Forestry. Hopefully it will come out in the next few months. I also wanted to point you out to this resource, Cifa Ramos, a good friend of mine. This is a great paper if you're looking into learning more on this topic. A couple things about Native youth engagement. Native Americans are highly underrepresented in STEM. And Terry Sherrick has a lot of excellent information about student demographics across the United States and natural resources. And one of the things that he points out is that, and in our other studies, is we see that there's likely less than 100 Native students in the wildlife profession and career track at any point in time. Yet it is a growing demographic, especially that age group. The American Indian Science and Engineering Society, ACES, is an excellent organization to tap into if you're interested in hiring or working with Native youth. That is the best resource out there. The Native Student Professional Development Program of the Wildlife Society is another great resource. Every year we host a whole cohort, which the Wildlife Society helps us promote through the Native Peoples Wildlife Management Working Group. And then lastly, the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, which Julie will talk in depth on, but they have youth seminars as well. The last couple resources I wanted to share, and I know I'm close to my end of my time here, is the Forest Service has our Office of Tribal Relations, and all of our regional tribal program managers are willing to assist and help make these connections between states and tribes. We also have a couple of the resources listed below, but the last thing I wanted to end on is just we really want to aim for increased cultural competency in these topics. And so with that, I just want to say Dawa, thank you so much, everybody, for your attention and your time. I do want to reiterate two of the comments that I heard from our panel already, and fantastic. Kurt mentioned that tribes are our best and strongest ally, and I just really wanted to reiterate that point. Tribes in terms of their land stewardship concepts and their worldview, but then also with their significant land base. I mean, it's almost like a no-brainer in my mind. And then lastly, Chandra said that treaties do not grant any rights. Tribes already possess these rights, and so it's really important for us to all remember as natural resource managers that these are rights that tribes have carried with them for millennia and will continue to do so. They are the first stewards on the landscape, and they are a really important group for us to be working with. So with that, Dawa, thank you so much. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the meeting.